Could a city built of wood and resentment do anything but burn? On the night of July 19th, in the year 64 of our era, Rome was not the eternal city of marble we imagine. It was a tinderbox of ambition, poverty, and secrets, a sprawling, chaotic metropolis of over 1 million souls crammed into towering, rickety apartment blocks called insula. And in the heart of this powder keg, near the great Circus Maximus, a spark was struck. It began in the shops lining the arena, places filled with flammable oils, textiles, and wood. But was it an accident? Eyewitnesses later spoke of something far more sinister. They saw men, not looters, but organized figures fanning the flames, throwing torches into homes, and when challenged, they shouted that they were merely following orders. Whose orders? That question would hang over the ashes of the world's capital like a shroud. The fire did not creep. It lunged. Fanned by a strong summer wind, it roared through the narrow, winding streets, a hungry beast devouring everything in its path. The wooden insulae, dry as bone from the summer heat, ignited like torches, their inhabitants trapped inside. Panic is a contagion, and it spread faster than the flames. The screams of the dying were drowned out by the roar of the fire and the crash of collapsing buildings. In that moment, Rome was not a city. It was a screaming mouth. There was no organized response. The city's rudimentary fire brigades, the vigiles, were overwhelmed, their paths blocked by rubble and a terrified, stampeding mob. Some accounts claim the vigiles themselves were paralyzed by contradictory orders, some trying to fight the blaze, while others seemed to be helping it spread. Imagine the terror. Your home, your world, devoured by a beast of flame. Where do you run when every street is a death trap? People flooded towards the few open spaces, the Campus Martius, the stone tombs on the city's outskirts. They carried what little they could salvage, a child, a sack of grain, a memory. Husbands lost wives, parents lost children. The social fabric of Rome, stretched thin by inequality and political strife, tore apart completely. Amid the chaos, two very different human instincts battled for supremacy. There were heroes, ordinary men and women who risked their lives to pull neighbors from burning buildings. And there were villains. Looters, emboldened by the collapse of order, swarmed through abandoned villas, their greed illuminated by the glow of the dying city. But the stories of those other men, the ones with the torches, persisted. They were not common criminals. They moved with purpose, with a chilling discipline, as if orchestrating the destruction. Was this a coordinated act of terror? A political statement written in fire? The fire was a great leveler. It consumed the squalid slums and the opulent mansions of the Palatine Hill with equal ferocity. It was a physical manifestation of the chaos brewing beneath the surface of the Roman peace. For years, the tension between the Emperor Nero and the old guard of the Senate had been escalating. The senators saw him as a decadent tyrant, an actor, a musician who disgraced his office with public performances. He saw them as a cabal of obstinate old men clinging to an obsolete republic, obstructing his vision for a new, more modern Rome. Hatred had been simmering for years. On that night, it boiled over and took the form of fire. The blaze burned with an unnatural intelligence. It would seem to die down in one district, only to erupt with renewed fury in another, miles away, as if multiple fires had been set simultaneously. It leapt across fire breaks, ignored the efforts of firefighters, and consumed everything. It was as if the city itself had decided to commit suicide. For 6 days and 7 nights the inferno raged. It was more than a catastrophe. It was an apocalypse. It erased not just homes and lives, but history itself. Temples built by the kings of Rome, shrines dedicated to the city's founding gods, priceless works of Greek art, collected over centuries, all turned to ash and smoke. The soul of the Republic was being immolated. And as the flames climbed higher, casting a demonic glow over the 7 hills, the people of Rome, huddled in refugee camps, began to ask the question that would seal an emperor's fate and echo through eternity. Who did this to us? Their gaze, filled with anger and despair, turned away from the burning city and towards the coast, towards the emperor's lavish seaside villa in Antium. What would the artist, the singer, the self-proclaimed god on earth do now that his stage was a pyre? The rumor that would define his legacy was born in the chaos of those first few days, whispered from one terrified refugee to another. Was this fire a monstrous act of an emperor clearing space for a new palace, or the most brilliant political frame-up in history? What's your first instinct? Was this the grand design of a cynical tyrant, or the masterstroke of a desperate senate? Let us know in the comments. The investigation has just begun. News travels fast, but bad news travels at the speed of light. In his opulent seaside villa at Antium, 50 kilometers from Rome, Nero Claudius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus, received the message that his capital was burning. The official narrative, the one he and his supporters would desperately try to promote, is a story of decisive leadership. He did not linger, he did not hesitate. He mounted his horse and raced back towards the inferno. He arrived to a city in its death throes, a vision of hell on earth. The air was thick with smoke, the sky blotted out by a vast roiling cloud of black ash. The heat was so intense it could be felt from miles away. Nero, for all his faults, was not a fool. He understood that this was not just a fire, it was a political crisis of the first magnitude. His throne was balanced on the goodwill of the Roman people, and that goodwill was currently being reduced to cinders. His actions in the immediate aftermath were, by all rational accounts, exemplary. He threw open his private gardens, the magnificent grounds of the Campus Martius, and the Agrippa monuments to house the tens of thousands of homeless. He personally directed the relief efforts, ordering emergency shelters to be built and commanding shipments of food to be brought up from the port of Ostia at his own expense. He even fixed the price of grain at a dramatically low level to prevent price gouging and starvation. He was seen among the people without his usual retinue of guards, comforting the afflicted and coordinating the rescue operations. He was, for a fleeting moment, the father of his people. But truth is a fragile thing in a city consumed by fear. While Nero fought the flames, another more powerful story was being forged in the heat of the popular imagination. It was a story so vivid, so perfectly aligned with the emperor's theatrical personality that it would eclipse all his documented efforts. The story goes like this. As Rome burned, Nero stood atop a tower, perhaps the Tower of Maecenas, dressed in a full theatrical costume. He looked out upon the destruction not with horror, but with aesthetic glee. And then, accompanying himself on the lyre, he began to sing. He sang of the fall of Troy, a classic epic of ruin and despair, his voice rising in lamentation as his city turned to ash below. It is a terrifying and unforgettable image. The artist-emperor, so detached from human suffering that he could turn the apocalypse into a private performance. A monster of pure aestheticism. But did it actually happen? The historian Tacitus, our most reliable source, treats it as a rumor, one of two competing versions of the story. Suetonius and Cassius Dio, writing decades later under a new dynasty hostile to Nero's memory, present it as undeniable fact. The image was simply too good, too damning to be questioned. It was the perfect propaganda. It confirmed every suspicion the senators had ever harbored about him, that he was not a ruler, but a performer, a man who saw life and death as a grand spectacle for his own amusement. Power is not just about legions and laws, it is about the story a ruler tells. And in that moment, Nero lost control of his own narrative. While he was busy with the logistics of disaster relief, his enemies were crafting a legend that would destroy him. They took his genuine passion for the arts, his love of Greek culture, and his theatrical flair, and twisted them into the monstrous caricature of a fiddling tyrant. A lie, it is said, can travel halfway around the world while the truth is putting on its shoes. In burning Rome, the lie traveled on wings of fire. Meanwhile, the physical destruction continued unabated. The fire, after devastating the central and southern parts of the city, was finally stopped at the foot of the Esquiline Hill by demolishing a vast swathe of buildings to create a firebreak. For a moment, it seemed the worst was over. But then, inexplicably, the fire broke out again in the Emiliana district, a different part of the city. This second outbreak was less destructive but politically far more damaging. Why? Because it started on the property of Aphonius Tigellinus, Nero's praetorian prefect and most hated advisor. This was no longer just a suspicion. For many, it was proof. The fire had been deliberately set, and the arsonists were in the palace itself. The emperor's relief efforts were forgotten. His generosity was reinterpreted as a sign of a guilty conscience. Every action he took was now viewed through a lens of suspicion. The ruler who sings of Troy's fall does not deserve to rule Rome. The firestorm was transforming into a political one, and Nero, trapped in the heart of his burning capital, was beginning to understand that the flames were the least of his problems. The real danger was the story they left behind. After 9 days, the fire finally burned itself out. Silence descended upon the ruins, a silence broken only by the weeping of the survivors and the whisper of the wind through the charred skeletons of buildings. Rome was a ghost of its former self. Of the city's 14 districts, 3 had been completely obliterated. Nothing remained. 7 more were a landscape of blackened rubble and gutted ruins. Only 4 districts had escaped unscathed. The heart of the empire had been torn out. The scale of the loss was incalculable. Hundreds of thousands were homeless, destitute, with nothing left but the clothes on their backs. The economic engine of the world had ground to a halt. But worse than the material loss was the psychological wound. The Romans believed their city was eternal, protected by the gods. The fire had shattered that belief. It felt like a divine judgment, a sign that the gods themselves had abandoned them. And in the vacuum left by faith, a more primal emotion took root: rage, a vast, undifferentiated anger that needed a target. The mob is a beast with many heads and no brain. It does not reason, it feels, and it felt betrayed. Fingers began to point. Some blamed the gods for their indifference. Some blamed their neighbors for imagined slights, but for a society built on a rigid hierarchy, the ultimate responsibility always rests at the top. All eyes turned to the Palatine Hill, or what was left of it. All anger converged on one man, Nero. His enemies in the Senate, who had watched his rise with a mixture of contempt and fear, saw their opportunity. For years, they had chafed under his populist policies, his artistic pretensions, and his disregard for their ancient authority. They had whispered in the corridors of power, plotting his downfall. The fire was a gift from the gods of vengeance. They began to fan the flames of public anger, subtly at first, then more openly. They spread the story of Nero singing on the tower. They reminded the people of his extravagant lifestyle, his endless spending on festivals and palaces, while they lived in squalor. They hinted that the fire was a convenient way to clear land for his grandiose building projects. They were masters of insinuation, and the desperate, grieving populace was a receptive audience. Nero was trapped. He was an absolute ruler, a living god in the eyes of many, but even a god cannot fight a rumor. He could feel the ground shifting beneath his feet. His advisors, particularly the ruthless and pragmatic Tigellinus, understood the political calculus perfectly. The crowd's anger was a tidal wave. If it was not diverted, it would crash against the palace and sweep them all away. They needed a culprit, and they needed one now. The logic of power is brutal and simple. In a time of crisis, if you cannot provide a solution, you must provide a sacrifice. A scapegoat was required, someone whose punishment would be so spectacular, so cathartic, that it would quench the people's thirst for revenge and distract them from the real questions of competence and responsibility. The search began. But who could be blamed for a crime of this magnitude? It had to be someone hated, someone feared, someone alien enough that the people would believe them capable of such an atrocity. It had to be a group that was already shrouded in suspicion, accused of dark rituals and a general hatred for the human race. The political survival of the emperor now depended on a single, ruthless decision. A scapegoat must be found, and when a regime is fighting for its life, justice is the first casualty. A chilling political game had begun, played out on the smoking ruins of a city. The prize was not just power, but survival itself. And in this game, entire peoples could be sacrificed like pawns. The great Roman witch hunt was about to begin. The fire had burned the city, but the fear it unleashed would now burn the soul of the empire. Who do you blame when the world ends? The answer for Nero's regime was simple. You blame those who secretly wish for the world to end. And in the teeming, multicultural metropolis of Rome, there was one group that fit the description perfectly: the Christians. At this point in history, Christianity was a new and poorly understood phenomenon. To the average Roman, they were not a distinct religion but a bizarre and secretive Jewish sect. They were outsiders, mysterious and aloof. They refused to participate in the state cults, to offer incense to the emperor's genius. This was not seen as a matter of conscience, but as an act of stubborn sedition, of atheism. Rumors born of ignorance and fear swirled around them. It was said they practiced cannibalism, ritually eating the body and drinking the blood of their leader. It was whispered they engaged in incestuous orgies during their secret love feasts. Their apocalyptic prophecies, their talk of a final judgment by fire, were twisted into evidence that they actively sought the destruction of the world. They were, in short, the perfect scapegoats. They were already accused of hatred for the human race. Blaming them for the fire was a small and logical next step. With a target identified, Tigellinus and his Praetorian Guard moved with terrifying efficiency. The arrests began. At first, they rounded up a few known Christians. Under torture, these individuals confessed. What they confessed is unclear, perhaps to anything their interrogators wanted to hear. More importantly, they named others. A chain reaction of accusations began, and soon the prisons were filled with men, women, and even children whose only crime was their faith. What followed was not justice. It was not even simple execution. It was a calculated spectacle of horror designed to satiate the mob's bloodlust and permanently associate the name Christian with unimaginable suffering. The historian Tacitus, a man with no love for Christians, whom he described as adherents of a deadly superstition, was nevertheless appalled by the cruelty he witnessed. His account is stomach-churning. Nero, he writes, offered his own gardens for the public slaughter. Some were crucified. Others were sewn into the skins of wild animals and thrown to hunting dogs to be torn to shreds for the amusement of the crowd. But the most grotesque fate was reserved for the night. Christians were tied to stakes, their bodies coated in pitch and tar and set ablaze. They were used as human torches to illuminate the emperor's garden parties. Nero himself, dressed as a charioteer, mingled with the crowds, enjoying the grisly spectacle from his chariot. Was this the act of a madman, a sadist reveling in cruelty? Or was it a cold political calculation? Perhaps both. Nero the artist was creating his most shocking performance yet, a tableau of terror designed to be unforgettable. Nero the politician was giving the people of Rome what they craved, a release for their anger, a clear and visible enemy upon whom they could pour out all their grief and hatred. By making the punishment so monstrously out of proportion to the alleged crime, he ensured that the spectacle, not the fire itself, would become the new focus of public attention. Can the brutal extermination of a few be justified to maintain the peace for millions? This is the eternal question of tyrants. For Nero and Tigellinus, the answer was a resounding yes. The slaughter worked, at least in the short term. The immediate pressure on the emperor subsided. The The whispers against him were drowned out by the screams of the dying Christians. He had successfully diverted the wave of popular fury, but in doing so he had set a terrible precedent. He had shown that the power of the state could be used to annihilate a minority group for political gain. He had legitimized religious persecution on a massive scale. The fire in Rome had been extinguished, but Nero had just lit a new one, a fire of intolerance and hatred that would burn for centuries. The ashes of the Christian martyrs settled over the emperor's gardens. And on this blood-soaked ground, on the ruins of the old city, Nero was about to begin the most ambitious project of his life, a project that would be seen as the ultimate proof of his guilt. When you're accused of burning down a city to build a palace, the sensible response is to lie low and act humbly. Nero was not a sensible man. On the vast swathe of land cleared by the fire, a territory that stretched from the Palatine Hill to the Esquiline Hill, he began construction on a monument to his own ego, the Domus Aurea, the Golden House. It was not so much a house as a city within a city. The scale was breathtaking, obscene even. The complex covered at least 125 acres in the very heart of Rome. It featured a colossal bronze statue of himself, 120 feet high, so large it was later mistaken for a statue of the sun god, Sol. There were palaces with revolving dining rooms, ceilings that showered guests with flowers and perfume, and walls inlaid with gold and precious stones. But the true luxury was space. In the middle of the most densely populated city on earth, Nero built an artificial countryside. There were vineyards, pastures with grazing herds, forests filled with wild animals, and a massive artificial lake, so large that the Colosseum would later be built on its drained basin. It was a staggering feat of engineering and artistry, a paradise on earth built for one man. For the people of Rome, huddled in temporary shelters, grieving for their dead and their lost homes, the Golden House was the final, unforgivable insult. The rumors now hardened into absolute certainty. Of course he had burned the city. Here was the proof, rising from the ashes. His pleasure dome built on their suffering. The project became a gaping maw, devouring the state's resources. To finance this and the broader rebuilding of Rome, Nero's government lurched into a financial crisis. The emperor resorted to desperate measures. He devalued the currency, reducing the silver content of the denarius, an act of financial wizardry that sparked inflation. He ordered the temples throughout the empire to be stripped of their treasures. He launched a series of politically motivated treason trials against wealthy senators, not for justice, but to confiscate their estates. A new reign of terror began, driven by fiscal necessity. The aristocracy, already seething with resentment, was now being bled dry to pay for a monument to the man they despised. Nero's genius was always at war with his political judgment. The broader plan for rebuilding Rome was, in fact, brilliant and forward-thinking. He mandated new building codes. The narrow, winding alleys were replaced with a grid of broad, straight streets. The new insulae were to be built to a limited height, constructed of stone and brick instead of wood, and equipped with porticos to provide shelter and fire breaks. He was, in effect, designing the world's first modern, fire-safe city. He was trying to ensure that a catastrophe like the Great Fire could never happen again, but these sensible reforms were completely overshadowed by the decadent splendor of the Domus Aurea. The good he did was buried under a mountain of gold and marble. Every stone laid in his new palace was seen as another piece of evidence in the case against him. The emperor was not just a tyrant, he was a thief who had stolen the very heart of their city for his private playground. The discontent was no longer confined to whispers. It was hardening into a conspiracy. The fire, the persecution of the Christians, and now the construction of the Golden House had created a perfect storm of hatred. The senatorial elite, pushed to the breaking point, decided that the time for plotting was over. The time for action had come. If the emperor would not be removed by the gods, he would have to be removed by the hand of man. In the shadowy villas of Rome's most powerful families, a plot began to take shape, a conspiracy that would bring together soldiers, poets, and politicians in a desperate gamble to kill a god. The Golden House was meant to be Nero's masterpiece, a symbol of his eternal glory. Instead, it became the gilded cage where a doomed emperor awaited his assassins. The fire had forged an alliance of the desperate. The Pisonian conspiracy, named after its charismatic figurehead, Gaius Calpurnius Piso, was not a small cabal of disgruntled nobles. It was a vast and sprawling network that cut across the highest echelons of Roman society. Senators who dreamed of restoring the Republic, knights who had lost their fortunes, and, most critically, high-ranking officers of the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's own bodyguards, all joined forces. Their motives were a cocktail of high-minded ideals and personal vendettas. Some, like the senator Plautius Lateranus, genuinely believed they were saving Rome from a tyrant. Others, like the Praetorian prefect Faenius Rufus, were driven by professional jealousy and fear for their own positions. The conspiracy even included Nero's own former tutor and advisor, the great Stoic philosopher Seneca, and Seneca's nephew, the poet Lucan. These were the men who had shaped Nero's mind, who had once been his closest confidants. Now they were plotting to drive a dagger into his throat. The plan was audacious. They would assassinate Nero during the circus games, an event where the emperor, a passionate fan of the chariot races, would be a predictable and relatively exposed target. Lateranus would throw himself at the emperor's feet as if begging for a favor and pull him to the ground. The other conspirators, armed with daggers hidden beneath their togas, would then rush in and finish the job. It was a scene straight out of a Roman tragedy, a reenactment of the assassination of Julius Caesar. The fate of an empire hung on the courage and discretion of a few dozen men. But conspiracies are like chains. They are only as strong as their weakest link. And in this chain, the weak link was a woman named Epicharis. A former slave, she was privy to the plot and, frustrated by the conspirators' endless delays and indecision, tried to recruit a naval officer into the cause. The officer, seeing a chance for reward, betrayed her. Epicharis was arrested and brutally tortured, but she revealed nothing, showing more courage than many of the noblemen who had enlisted her. Her arrest, however, sent a wave of panic through the conspirators. One of them, a senator named Flavius Scaevinus, lost his nerve. He made a will, gave his favorite dagger a ceremonial sharpening, and then handed it to his freedman, Milicus, with instructions to have bandages and styptics ready. Milicus, putting the pieces together and tempted by the promise of freedom and wealth, went straight to the emperor. The conspiracy collapsed like a house of cards. Nero, his paranoia now fully unleashed, responded with a wave of terror that dwarfed the persecution of the Christians. This was not about finding a scapegoat for the masses. This was a personal and vicious purge of the class that had dared to challenge him. The trials were a sham. Accusations were enough for a death sentence. Piso, upon learning of the betrayal, killed himself. The others were rounded up one by one. Lateranus was executed. Faenius Rufus was put to death. The poet Lucan was ordered to commit suicide and bled to death in a warm bath while reciting his own poetry. The most famous victim was Seneca. Nero sent a tribune to his villa with the death sentence. The philosopher, ever the Stoic, accepted his fate with calm resignation. He too opened his veins, dying slowly and agonizingly, lecturing his friends on philosophy until the very end. Rome was paralyzed by fear. No one felt safe. The emperor saw assassins in every shadow. Informers grew rich on the estates of the condemned. It was a bloodbath of the elite, a systematic extermination of anyone with a powerful name or an independent mind. The fire had given Nero's enemies a reason to conspire. The conspiracy now gave Nero a reason to become the blood-soaked tyrant they had always accused him of being. He had survived the plot, but he had killed what was left of his own legitimacy. He now ruled not by consent or affection, but by sheer terror. But how do we know all this? Who recorded the last words of Seneca, the secret meetings of the plotters, the terror in the palace? Our understanding of these events comes from a handful of historians, men who wrote decades after Nero's death. And as we peel back the layers of their narratives, we are forced to ask a disquieting question. Were they recording history, or were they finishing the job the conspirators had started? History, it is said, is written by the victors. In the case of Nero, it was written by the victor's employees. Our three main literary sources for the Great Fire and its aftermath are Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio. None of them were eyewitnesses. They were all writing long after Nero was dead and buried under a new dynasty, the Flavians, who had built their legitimacy on the ruins of Nero's reputation. To understand their accounts, you have to understand their politics. Slandering the last of the Julio-Claudians was not just good history, it was good career advice. Let's start with Tacitus, the most respected and seemingly objective of the three. He wrote his Annals around the year 117, more than 50 years after the fire. He is a master of rhetoric, a brilliant and cynical analyst of power. He is also our only source for the claim that some Christians confessed and for the horrific details of their execution. But even Tacitus is careful. When it comes to the ultimate question of Nero's guilt in starting the fire, he presents both versions of the story, that it was an accident and that it was an imperial order. He notes that sources differ. However, he then spends far more time and literary energy describing the lurid rumors of Nero singing on the tower, lending them a weight and credibility that his feigned objectivity cannot hide. He plants the seed of doubt and then waters it with masterful insinuation. He knows a good story when he sees one, and the story of the mad arsonist emperor is infinitely more compelling than a mundane accident. Then we have Suetonius, who was a court official writing around the same time. His Lives of the 12 Caesars is less a history and more a collection of biographical sketches filled with scandalous gossip, lurid anecdotes, and character assassinations. Suetonius has no time for nuance. For him, Nero's guilt is a foregone conclusion. He states it as fact, claiming that the emperor, disgusted by the ugliness of the old city, openly sent men to set it on fire. He is the primary source for many of the most damning and least verifiable stories about Nero's depravity. He is not a historian in the modern sense. He is a purveyor of imperial gossip, and his work reads like a first-century tabloid. Finally, there is Cassius Dio, a Greek senator who wrote his Roman history over a century later, around the year 229. By his time, the black legend of Nero was so firmly established that he treats it as historical canon. He combines the accounts of Tacitus and Suetonius, adds his own rhetorical flourishes, and presents the most theatrical and damning portrait of all. He describes Nero climbing to the palace roof to get the best view, wearing his lyre player's costume and singing his song of Troy with gusto. The rumor has become undisputed fact, so can we trust them? They are indispensable sources, but they are not gospel. They were senators or men who worked for senators, and they wrote with the inherent bias of the Roman aristocracy against an emperor who had curtailed their power and, in the end, slaughtered their members. Furthermore, they were writing to please a new regime. The Flavians, Vespasian, and his sons had come to power through civil war. They needed to portray the man they replaced as a monster to justify their own rule. The Great Fire was the perfect weapon. What about the archaeological evidence? It confirms the vast scale of the destruction. It confirms that Nero's new city was built with wider streets and more fire-resistant materials. But it offers no smoking gun, no evidence of arson. In fact, modern analysis suggests the fire's rapid spread was likely due to the wind and the city's construction, not a coordinated plot. And what of Nero's motive? The idea that he burned the city to build his golden house seems compelling, but it falls apart under scrutiny. He could have simply expropriated the land he needed, as Roman emperors often did. Committing arson on such a colossal scale, an act that destroyed vast amounts of property he himself owned and risked unleashing a revolution, was an insane and unnecessarily risky way to go about a simple urban renewal project. The fire, in reality, was a financial and political disaster for him. It crippled his treasury and destroyed his popular support. The tragedy was not the catalyst for his dream project. It was the catalyst for his downfall. The words of the historians have sealed his fate, turning a complex political figure into a one-dimensional monster. But the fire had another legacy, one far more tangible than a damaged reputation. The cost of rebuilding Rome and the even greater cost of the Golden House had emptied the imperial coffers. A broke empire is a desperate empire. The financial crisis born in the ashes of Rome now began to spread. The fire was about to leap the borders of the city and set the provinces ablaze. Who pays the price for a ruler's grand vision? The answer is always the same: the people. To fund the reconstruction of Rome and the bottomless pit of the Domus Aurea, Nero's administration began to systematically squeeze the provinces. The provincial governors, under immense pressure from the capital, were forced to levy crushing new taxes, invent new fees, and confiscate property on the flimsiest of pretexts. For years, the provinces had enjoyed a relative stability under the Roman peace. Now they were being bled dry to pay for a new city and a golden palace they would never see. The resentment, which had always simmered beneath the surface, began to boil. The fire in Rome had provided the spark. Imperial greed now provided the fuel. The first major explosion occurred in the year 68 in Gaul. The governor of Gallia Lugdunensis, a Romanized Gaul of noble descent named Gaius Julius Vindex, had had enough. He was a man of action, not words. He raised his legions and openly declared rebellion against Nero. But this was not just another provincial revolt. Vindex was a shrewd politician. He knew he couldn't win alone. So he sent messages to the other provincial governors, urging them to join him in a war to liberate the human race from a tyrant. He championed a new candidate for the throne, Servius Sulpicius Galba, the aging and respected governor of Hispania Tarraconensis. Galba was a relic of the old republic, a stern and disciplined commander from a distinguished senatorial family. He was everything Nero was not. Initially, Galba hesitated. Declaring oneself emperor was treason, and the punishment for failure was a gruesome death. But Vindex's rebellion gained momentum and other commanders began to waver. Galba, sensing the tide was turning, finally accepted the challenge. He declared himself not emperor, but the legate of the Senate and the Roman people, a clever turn of phrase that signaled his intention to restore power to the aristocracy. The dominoes began to fall. The fire, which had started in a few shops in Rome, had now become a conflagration engulfing the entire Western Empire. Nero's reaction was strangely erratic. At first, he dismissed the news of Vindex's revolt, joking that he would simply confiscate the rebels' property and use it to fund his next musical tour. He seemed incapable of grasping the mortal danger he was in. His disconnect from reality, a condition that perhaps began as he watched Rome burn, was now total. He spent his days practicing on a new water organ he had invented, discussing musical theory while his empire was crumbling around him. But as the rebellion spread and Galba's legions began to march, panic finally set in. Nero declared Galba a public enemy and began to devise a series of bizarre and fantastical plans. He would replace all the governors and army commanders in Gaul with his personal friends. He would march against the rebels himself, armed not with weapons but with his lyre, and he would win them back by singing to them. If that failed, he would have the entire population of Gaul massacred. It was the ranting of a man who had lost his grip. The real power in Rome now lay not with the emperor, but with the Praetorian Guard. Their prefect, Nymphidius Sabinus, saw his chance. He secretly entered into negotiations with Galba's agents. He then went to the Praetorian camp and told them a lie. He claimed Nero had already fled the city and promised each soldier a massive donative in Galba's name if they would declare him emperor. The guard, whose loyalty had always been for sale to the highest bidder, promptly abandoned the man they had sworn to protect. Nero's power had rested on two pillars, the love of the people and the loyalty of the army. The fire had burned away the first. The rebellions had now kicked away the second. The artist was alone on his empty stage. The final act of his tragedy was about to begin. An emperor without an army is just a man in a fancy house. When Nero awoke in his golden house on the morning of June 9th, 68, he found that his world had vanished. His Praetorian guards, the sentinels who were his shadow and his shield, were gone. They had deserted him in the night. His friends, the courtiers who had flattered him and feasted with him, no longer answered his summons. The palace, once a bustling hub of power, was now silent and empty. The terror he had inflicted upon the Roman elite had come home to roost. He had taught them that loyalty was meaningless and that survival depended on timely betrayal. Now they were simply applying the lesson he had taught them. In a blind panic, he fled. Disguised in a shabby cloak, his face partially hidden, the master of the world slipped out of his own palace like a common thief. He was accompanied by a handful of his last remaining loyalists, all of them freedmen, former slaves. It was a pathetic and humiliating flight. He rode out of the city, his horse startled by the stench of a rotting corpse by the roadside. He overheard a soldier remark to another, "They are in pursuit of Nero," and another ask, "What news of Nero in the city?" His identity was an open secret. He was a fugitive in his own empire. His destination was a small suburban villa belonging to his freedman, Phaon, a few miles outside Rome. There he hid, huddled in a small, dark room, a parody of his former grandeur. Word reached him that the Senate, emboldened by the Praetorians' defection, had finally found its courage. They had met, declared Nero a public enemy, and sentenced him to be beaten to death in the Forum. The hunt was on. He could hear the thunder of horsemen approaching. The end was here. He knew he had to take his own life, the last act of a Roman nobleman facing disgrace. But he could not do it. He held a dagger to his throat, but his hand trembled. He lamented his own cowardice, weeping and muttering, "To live is a disgrace, a shame." He begged one of his companions to kill himself first, to set an example. None would oblige. The artist who had staged the deaths of thousands now found himself unable to stage his own. He was an actor who had forgotten his final lines. Finally, as the sound of the approaching soldiers grew louder, he knew he could delay no longer. With the help of his secretary, Epaphroditus, who guided his hand, he plunged the dagger into his neck. He was 30 years old. As he lay dying, a Roman centurion burst into the room, claiming he had come to save him. The officer tried to stanch the bleeding with his cloak. Nero looked up at him, his life draining away, and uttered his last immortal words. "Too late. This is fidelity." And then a final whisper that would echo through history, a perfect epitaph for his bizarre and tragic life. "Qualis artifex pereo." What an artist dies in me. It is a line of breathtaking arrogance and profound self-pity. In his final moments, faced with the ruin of his empire and his own violent death, his greatest regret was for the loss of his artistic talent. He saw his life not as a ruler, but as a performance. And the fire, the persecutions, the conspiracies, the civil war, they were all just scenes in his grand, bloody tragedy. The death of the artist did not bring the curtain down. It was merely the end of the first act. His demise did not restore the Republic or bring peace. It created a power vacuum, and nature, especially political nature, abhors a vacuum. The fire that Nero was accused of starting had now claimed him as its final victim. But his death had unleashed a new and even more destructive inferno, a full-blown civil war that would tear the Roman world apart. The artist was dead, but his final, chaotic masterpiece was just beginning. Nero's death was not a solution, it was a catalyst for chaos. The year 69 of our era would go down in Roman history as the Year of the Four Emperors, a bloody testament to the instability Nero left in his wake. His suicide had decapitated the Julio-Claudian dynasty, which had ruled Rome for a century. Now the throne was up for grabs, and the only qualification was the strength of your legions. The empire became a battlefield for ambitious generals. First came Galba, the old senator who had led the revolt. He marched into Rome and began a reign of austerity and discipline. He refused to pay the donative promised to the Praetorian Guard who had put him in power, a fatal mistake. After only 7 months, the disgruntled guards murdered him in the Roman Forum, parading his severed head on a pike. They proclaimed a new emperor, Otho, one of Nero's former friends and a notorious dissolute. Otho's reign was even shorter. The powerful legion stationed on the Rhine frontier had already declared their own commander, Vitellius, as emperor. Vitellius marched on Italy, and Otho's forces were defeated in a brutal battle. Seeing his cause was lost, Otho committed suicide after ruling for just 3 months. Vitellius then entered Rome and began a reign of gluttony and excess that made Nero's parties look tame. But in the east, another power was stirring. The legions fighting the Jewish revolt in Judea had their own candidate, their commander, Titus Flavius Vespasianus. Vespasian was a tough, pragmatic, and professional soldier from a humble family. His legions declared him emperor, and the final decisive phase of the civil war began. The armies of the east marched against the armies of the west. The ensuing conflict was a horror show of Roman-on-Roman violence. The empire that had conquered the world now turned its sword upon itself. Vespasian's forces under the command of Antonius Primus ultimately triumphed, and Vitellius was captured, dragged through the streets of Rome, tortured, and thrown into the Tiber River. Vespasian arrived in Rome to restore order. He was the 4th emperor in a single year, and he would be the one to last. He founded the Flavian dynasty, which would rule Rome for the next generation. But his new dynasty was built on a foundation of civil war and illegitimacy. He needed a powerful narrative to justify his rule, to wash away the blood of his rivals. He needed to prove that the old regime, the one he had overthrown, was not just flawed, but monstrous. The Great Fire of Rome became the cornerstone of this new imperial propaganda. The Flavians and the historians who worked for them, Tacitus, Suetonius, took the rumors and suspicions surrounding Nero and forged them into a black legend, an official history of irredeemable evil. Nero was no longer a flawed emperor. He was the Antichrist, the arsonist of Rome, the murderer of Christians, the matricide, the incarnation of madness and tyranny. The fire was no longer a complex event with ambiguous causes. It was the supreme act of a diabolical ruler. This narrative served a vital political purpose. It created a clear break with the past. It presented the Flavians not as usurpers who had won a bloody power struggle, but as saviors who had liberated Rome from a monster. The fire became the point of no return, the ultimate symbol of the Julio-Claudian dynasty's corruption. It was a simple, powerful story that everyone could understand. It unified the empire in shared condemnation of the fallen emperor. And so the myth became more real than the reality. The question of who or what started the Great Fire became irrelevant. What mattered was who was blamed. And in the court of history, written by his enemies, Nero was found guilty. He was the scapegoat not just for the fire, but for all the deep-seated problems of the Roman Empire, the conflict between the emperor and the Senate, the instability of the succession, and the dangerous power of the legions. The fire did not destroy Rome. It revealed the cracks in its foundation, and it taught a timeless lesson about power, that a tragedy is not just a tragedy, it is an opportunity to seize control, to rewrite the past, and to create an enemy against whom a new order can be built. The Flavian dynasty built its legitimacy on the ashes of Nero's reputation, turning a catastrophe into a political instrument. They offered the people a simple, comforting narrative, appointing an absolute evil. But history is rarely so simple. And this leaves us with a final, unsettling question. In a moment of profound crisis, what does a society need more? A complex, inconvenient truth, or a reassuring, unifying legend? Let us know your choice in the comments. Your perspective is the final piece of this story.